listener production.
It started quietly. On the 24th of January 2016, two people vanished from Logan, just south of Brisbane in Queensland. 28-year-old Corey Breton and 31-year-old Juliana Triscaru were reported missing by concerned family members. They hadn't been seen in days. Their phones rang out. Social media, where both had been active, went silent. Something had happened, but no one could possibly have predicted what was about to unfold. I'm Dan Mullins. This is Crime Insider's Judgment, a deep dive on a judge's final verdict of a crime and what transpired to incite that judgment. Corey and Juliana weren't strangers to police. They were part of a troubled scene involving methamphetamine, petty crime, and complex social entanglements. A community united by drugs. When days turned into weeks, what initially seemed like just another case of people going underground transformed into something far more sinister. 18 days later, their bodies were found in a toolbox submerged in Scrubby Creek, a local waterway renowned for being polluted with shopping trolleys and old tyres. The pair was bound, gagged, beaten and locked alive in a metal box. Their murders would become known as one of Queensland's most heinous crimes, a gruesome example of drug-fueled violence, mob mentality and cold-blooded cruelty. Corey Breton had grown up rough. Known to friends as sharp-tongued and street-smart, he also had a criminal record and a meth habit. Yet those who knew him said he had a big heart, was deeply loyal, and despite his circumstances, remained close to his family. Juliana Triscaru was a Romanian-born mother of two who'd lived in Australia since childhood. Her path had been rocky. She battled substance abuse and found herself in unstable relationships. By 2016, she was drifting through Logan's underbelly, part of the same chaotic world as Corey. Neither had known stable employment. Both were known in drug circles, and both were caught up in dangerous rumours that Corey was a police informant and Juliana was linked to him. In this paranoid subculture, such rumours often carried lethal consequences. They were not simply collateral damage, they were targeted. And what followed was a calculated act of retribution. In the weeks before their deaths, tensions rose within a group of drug dealers and users who operated out of a Kingston townhouse. This address was known for dealing, debt collection, and occasional violence. It was known by residents and customers as the TAV. Corey had apparently been accused of stealing drugs. More dangerously, whispers began to circulate that he had been talking to police. Whether or not this was true didn't matter. What mattered was perception. A decision was made. He had to be confronted. Some say the plan was to scare him. Others believed it was to send a permanent message. When Juliana and Corey went to the Kingston unit on January the 24th, she was swept up in the ambush. The logic was brutal and simple. If she knew him and associated with him, she was part of the problem. The townhouse, a modest 2-story unit, became the site of terror. According to court testimony, Corey and Juliana were ambushed. They were zip-tied, gagged and blindfolded. They were confined first in a bathroom, then in a hallway, while a group of perpetrators, Trent Michael Thrupp, Davey Malu Jr. Taiahu, Stowe Daniels and Waylon Nakito Cowan Walker, deliberated their fate. Daniels was a local drug dealer. One witness testified that Corey was beaten repeatedly. Loud music was played to muffle the noise. Witnesses told the court they saw the group drinking and playing video games while their victims whimpered, bound and bleeding. Corey and Juliana cried for help. No one came. No one called police. Eventually, a decision was made. The group placed Corey and Juliana into a large metal toolbox that had been brought into the house. The lid was screwed shut. They were still alive. In the early hours of the 25th of January, a friend of the group, Tuirangi Thomas Tahita, was recruited to drive his Hilux ute with the toolbox strapped to the tray and with the victim still inside to Scrubby Creek, less than 15 kilometres away. The box was loaded onto the ute, driven to the creek and dumped into the water. To ensure it would sink, tyres, garbage bags and concrete blocks were stacked on top. It worked. The box disappeared beneath the surface. For the next 2 weeks, the perpetrators, Throp, Taiaho, Tahiata, Daniels and Walker, returned to life as normal. Some partied, others kept low. A few moved houses. Walker fled to New Zealand. But soon, the net began to tighten. When the missing persons reports came in, police were initially unsure how to proceed. But phone records, witness tips, and inconsistencies in statements raised alarms. One of the key breaks came when a person of interest under arrest for another matter told detectives about the toolbox. Based on this, police launched a large-scale search of Scrubby Creek. On the 11th of February, divers recovered the toolbox. It had been submerged for over 2 weeks. Inside were the decomposed bodies of Corey and Juliana, bound, gagged, and clearly murdered. News of the discovery spread quickly. Media coverage was intense. Politicians condemned the killings, and police moved fast. Despite decomposition, forensic examiners were able to determine key facts. Both victims were zip-tied and gagged. Corey had a fractured jaw and other head injuries. Juliana had bruising and signs of restraint. The cause of death was likely suffocation and confinement in a sealed space. Inside the toolbox were cleaning supplies, duct tape, plastic bags, and a residue of bodily fluids. DNA analysis confirmed the identities. Traces of the possible suspects were found on tape and bindings. A potential vehicle used to transport the box had matching tyre marks near the creek. Mobile phone data placed possible suspects at the townhouse and Scrubby Creek. CCTV captured vehicles and movements consistent with what witnesses were telling police. This was enough to issue warrants. 8 people were eventually charged in connection with the murders, but 4 stood at the centre. Sto Daniels was the alleged ringleader. He controlled the Kingston property. Davey Taiaho provided the muscle described as brutal and controlling. Trent Thrupp was described as the logistics organiser, helping source and transport the toolbox. And Waylon Naketo Cowan Walker was outside the unit complex when the bodies were loaded onto the ute. In the following days, he drove Daniels and Taiaho to a hotel to hide. Others were charged with accessory offences or with assisting after the fact. The group was tied together by drug use, paranoia, and an internal belief that Corey's actions had put them all at risk. The trials would test Queensland's laws on joint enterprise and complicity. Coming up, the backstory. What was the catalyst for what happened? Sto Daniels became convinced that Corey Breton, who was also involved in drug dealing, was setting him up. This mistrust stemmed from a seemingly innocent exchange. Faku was a convenience store owner who allegedly sold burner phones and had ties to drugs. He sent Daniels a CCTV image of a man sourcing drugs. Breton confirmed to Koo that the person in the image he was being shown was Sto Daniels. This confirmation triggered Daniels' paranoia. He believed he was being identified and possibly set up. In response, Daniels orchestrated the luring of Breton and Triscaru to the TAV. In other words, what began as a drug transaction dispute spiraled into tragedy. Daniels' paranoia about being set up became the precise catalyst for the brutal double murder. In order to describe what happened next, I'll read from the judgment as delivered by Judges Mullins, Bond and Livesay in the Supreme Court of Queensland in the eventual appeal of Thrupp, Taiaho, Walker and Daniels. By way of background, Natakuna Moretti knew Juliana Triscaru. Their children had played together. To the judgment. Natakuna Moretti gave evidence that at 3:38 p.m. there was telephone contact between her and Daniels in which Daniels asked her to come to the TAV. CCTV evidence and the testimony of Moretti shows that she arrived at the TAV with a male friend, Webster Latu, and two other friends at about 8 minutes past 4. Moretti and Latu went into the residence and asked whether there were any drugs to buy. Daniels said, "Not yet," and asked her to wait and to tell the two people who were waiting outside to leave. They left, and Moretti then became involved with the events that transpired. Moretti's evidence was that upon entering the TAV, she saw Breton and Triscaru on the couch. She said that they were in trouble because Breton had a scratch on his leg and Triscaru had been crying and looked like she had been hit on the mouth. Daniels asked her to search Triscaru's bra, which she did, finding nothing. She then went into the garage with Daniels and Latu, where Daniels showed Moretti a picture of himself on Breton's phone and the messages between Faku, the local shopkeeper who allegedly sold burner phones to drug dealers, and Breton. Moretti's evidence of their conversation was as follows. Police asked, "What did Daniels say about that photograph and those messages?" He wanted to know why his photo was on his phone. Police asked, "Anything else?" Moretti responded, "We all thought they were trying to set him up." Moretti went on to say, "I thought that he was being set up, and I assumed he thought that too. Every single one of us." They re-entered the house. Moretti saw Breton and Triscaru being asked why Daniels' photo was on Breton's phone. Moretti said she was then asked by Daniels to purchase alcohol and by Thrupp to purchase cleaning equipment. The apparent purpose was to clean up blood from the floor and couch at the TAV. Daniels provided Moretti with money. Moretti called her friend, Teresi Titimanu, and asked him to meet her at the unit. He picked her up in a Toyota Yaris, and CCTV evidence shows that the two left the unit and returned at 14 minutes past 6. Just before she had left to go to the shops, Moretti saw Breton and Triscaru had had their hands and feet tied up with duct tape. She acknowledged that she did not see that occur and that it was possible that they may have been bound that way when she first arrived at the TAV. Leyland Harrington also lived at the TAV. His evidence was crucial in convicting Thrupp, Taiaho, Daniels and Walker. I'll return to the judgment. Harrington's evidence was that after Moretti and Titimanu had left, Latu and Thrupp had brought a toolbox from the garage into the lounge room. Daniels then told Breton and Triscaru to get in the box, to go lay down in it. The lid had been left open at this stage, and Harrington said that at one point, when no one else was around, he had seen Triscaru climb out of the toolbox and put her hand to her mouth, telling Harrington to shush. Harrington said that he immediately ran upstairs to notify Daniels, Taiaho, and a fourth man, Tupuna Mariri, of the attempted escape, and Mariri then assisted Taiaho and Thrupp with putting Triscaro back into the toolbox. Thrupp had been in the garage. Harrington's evidence was that when he came back downstairs, Thrupp's hand was over Triscaro's mouth, which had blood running from it. Harrington helped them put her back in the toolbox. They shut the lid and locked it. CCTV evidence shows Taiata returned in the Hilux to the TAV at about 6:10 p.m. Walker returned in the Peugeot a few minutes later, and Moretti returned in the Yaris at about the same time. Once she returned to the TAV, Moretti observed that the two people who had been on the couch when she left were now in a closed toolbox that she had earlier seen in the garage. She heard a woman screaming from inside. She said that Daniels, Thrupp and Taiata were out the back of the unit when she arrived. She overheard a conversation between them where she heard the word Coolangatta mentioned, and she heard Taiata say he was going to do it. She said that Taiaho was upstairs at the unit. She also said to the person who brought the Peugeot to the unit, that is Walker, was upstairs at the unit. Moretti and Harrington both gave evidence that once Moretti had returned to the unit, they began cleaning up. Harrington said that Latu began cleaning blood off the couch with methylated spirits, before pouring the liquid on the ground and wiping it up with towels. Harrington gave evidence that Breton and Triscaro had been banging on the lid. Taiaho had opened the lid and punched Breton and then Triscaro twice in the head. Triscaro had put her arms out of the toolbox to prevent the lid from being closed again, and Daniels had sliced her arms with a knife and told her to put her fucking hands down. Harrington gave evidence that items that had been used to clean up at the TAV were put in garbage bags, and the garbage bags were loaded into the toolbox on top of Breton and Triscaro by Daniels, Taiaho, Thrupp and Mariri. Harrington's evidence was that the lid of the toolbox was unlocked to allow the rubbish to be put in and then locked again once that happened. Harrington and Moretti said that about 20 minutes after that, the toolbox was taken to the Hilux and strapped on the back of the Hilux by Taiata, Taiaho, Thrupp and Latu. Harrington said that when the toolbox was initially picked up by Taiata, he nearly dropped it, and then Daniels pushed Harrington forward and told him to help Taiata. Music was played loudly so as to cover the screams of Breton and Triscaro in the toolbox. Although Walker had arrived back at the TAV about 6:15, the evidence did not suggest that he actually participated in putting Breton and Triscaro in the toolbox or in carrying the toolbox to the Hilux. Harrington suggested that Walker had been in the garage and around the stairs. He conceded that Walker, who he referred to as the lanky Maori, arrived after Breton and Triscaro had been locked in the toolbox. Harrington said that while they were both in the garage, Walker had asked him if it was my first time doing this, and Harrington shook his head. Harrington said that from what he did see of Walker, he would agree that Walker's body language was that of someone who did not want to be there. Harrington did say that whilst Walker was on the stairs, Walker was in a position to see the toolbox carried through the hallway to the front door of the TAV and to hear Breton and Triscaro kicking and screaming because they were really loud. However, in cross-examination, some doubt was cast on the extent to which Walker could have seen the toolbox whilst it was still inside the unit. However, no doubt was cast on his ability to perceive that Breton and Triscaro must have been in the toolbox when it was carried out from the unit. Harrington said that blood had leaked from the toolbox all the way out to the front door and that he had mopped up the pool of blood which had leaked out. The Hilux had been backed into the car park outside the front door and the toolbox loaded there. A neighbour had seen a ute with a toolbox strapped on the back at the TAV. She had heard loud music in the truck and a banging noise, which she later clarified sounded like a banging noise like a hand on the toolbox banging. Another neighbour also heard loud music and banging coming from a ute leaving the TAV. Yet another neighbour heard loud music and kicking sounds from the back of a green ute. His partner heard really loud music coming from a car at the same time. Once the toolbox was loaded onto the Hilux, Tayahata and Thrupp then got into the Hilux and the other individuals got into different cars. Not all the rubbish had been loaded into the toolbox. Harrington said that there were still some bloody towels and stuff which had been emptied out of Triscaru's bag, which was placed in garbage bags and thrown into the tray of a Ford Courier. CCTV evidence and the testimony of Moretti suggested that the circumstances of various people departing from the TAV on the evening of the 24th of January was as follows. Commencing at about 8:30 p.m. with only a few minutes separating the first and last vehicles, a convoy of 5 vehicles left the TAV in this order. A Peugeot driven by Walker with Daniels as a passenger. The Hilux driven by Tayahata with Thrupp as a passenger and carrying the toolbox which held Breton and Triscaru. A Mitsubishi Pajero driven by Latu with Moretti as a passenger. The Toyota Yaris with Titimanu, and Breton's Ford Courier driven by Harrington with Mariri and Taiaho as passengers. Traffic cameras show the Hilux carrying the toolbox drove eastbound along the Pacific Motorway at 8:32 p.m. before it doubled back and drove westbound on the Ipswich Motorway at 8:39 p.m., ending up at Scrubby Creek. Harrington gave evidence that he, Mariri and Taiaho had initially driven the Ford to a shisha bar near the TAV where they ordered shisha and Mariri and Taiaho used their mobile phones. At the instruction of Taiaho, Harrington then drove the two of them to a nearby cul-de-sac called Mudgee Street, where a dirt road could be used to access Scrubby Creek. There, Harrington observed the Hilux driving on the road away from the lagoons. Harrington said that Tayahata got out of the Hilux and walked over to the Ford. Harrington observed that Tayahata was splattered with mud. Harrington observed the following conversation between Tayahata and Taiaho. Taiaho asked him, "Is it done?" And Tayahata said, "Yes, it's done." On the 25th of January 2016, Daniels, Thrupp and Taiaho all checked into the Evolution Apartments in Brisbane City and stayed there until around the 9th or 10th of February. Walker attended for a few hours on the 25th but left the same day. He later purchased a one-way ticket to Auckland and flew out on the 13th of February. Breton's partner and their daughter had flown to Sydney on the 20th of January, having been driven to the airport by Breton. They flew back to Brisbane on the 29th of January, and Breton was not there to meet them, as he was supposed to be. His partner reported him missing the following morning. On the 10th of February 2016, Tayahata took police to a waterhole at Scrubby Creek. The following day, police divers located at that waterhole the toolbox containing both deceased, weighed down by concrete and tyres. When the toolbox was eventually recovered by police and opened, they found that rubbish had been placed in the toolbox on top of Breton and Triscaro. The bodies had been recovered. The first trial was held in 2021. Daniels, Taiaho, Thrupp and Walker stood trial for murder in the Supreme Court. The Crown presented a brutal timeline. Leland Harrington testified in exchange for immunity. He recounted the beatings, the casual cruelty, and the terrified cries. CCTV and phone data placed the men at the townhouse and near Scrubby Creek. Forensic evidence sealed the link. The jury found Daniels, Tayaho and Thrupp guilty of 2 counts of murder. Each received life sentences. Walker was found guilty of manslaughter. The families wept. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But the legal battle wasn't over. In 2023, the Queensland Court of Appeal quashed the convictions. It found the trial judge had failed to properly instruct the jury on how to assess individual culpability in a joint criminal enterprise. Specifically, the directions were inadequate in helping jurors decide whether each accused shared the necessary intent. In a case involving multiple people playing different roles, this was critical. The convictions were overturned. Retrials were ordered. This was devastating for the victims' families. After years of pain, they would now have to sit through the horror again. The retrial took place in 2025. Evidence was largely the same, but the legal framing was sharper. Jurors were instructed carefully on how to consider each accused's role. The defense argued the intent was to scare, not kill, that the deaths were an accident. But the prosecution countered. Placing people in a sealed metal box was not discipline. It was murder. Witnesses again described the ordeal. Forensic experts reinforced the impossibility of survival inside a sealed toolbox. The weight of circumstantial and direct evidence left little room for doubt. After weeks of testimony, the jury again found Daniels, Tayaho and Thrupp guilty of 2 counts of murder. They were sentenced to life in prison, eligible for parole after 30 years. Walker's manslaughter conviction stood. Justice Glenn Martin described the offending as appalling. He told the court, "It is difficult to imagine the immense terror that each must have felt over the hours leading up to their cruel deaths." The premeditated nature, the prolonged suffering, and the contempt for human life demanded the highest penalties. Daniels, Tayaho, and Thrupp showed little emotion. Walker cried. The families of Corey and Juliana embraced. After 9 years, justice was delivered. Others involved in the crimes. Webster Latu was sentenced to 12 years jail. Tapuna Mariri received a 13-year sentence. Natakuna Marati received a 9-year sentence, and Leland Harrington received 18 months, wholly suspended. The Logan toolbox murders have become shorthand for a certain kind of violence, drug-fueled, paranoid, and pack-driven. It revealed how quickly groupthink can turn legal, and how certain lives are undervalued because of their circumstances. Corey Breton and Juliana Triscaru were not perfect, but they were people, parents, friends, and children. They deserved more than a metal box and a watery grave. Thanks for listening to Crime Insider's Judgments. We love hearing your feedback, so please rate and review this episode. If you have a case you want us to cover, let us know via Instagram at Listener Crime or TikTok at Listener Crime Team. I'll be back again next Thursday with another case. I'm Dan Mullins, with sound design by Niall Fernandez. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.